save the quality of the camera feed. All right, today we are going to look at chapter 4, finish chapter 4, and there are two particular aspects of chapter 4 I want us to think about. One, righteous in the position of power, and two, sacrificial life. Because these are two of the things that are highlighted. So when we go back to chapter 4, let's go back to chapter 4. All right. When we examine verses 4 to verse 12 to 14, yeah, verse 14, 4 to 14. There are a number of things that we can identify in the passage. But one of the things I want us to focus our attention on is the importance of righteous people being in possession or in position of power and influence in our secular world. So yes, we argue the point. We are in the world, we're not of the world. But being in the world means that we are affected by whatever laws are handed down. We are affected by whatever decisions the authority makes, institutions make. So even though as believers, spiritually, morally, we don't fall in line with the construct of the world. We don't fall in line with the construct of the world. But we are described as royal priesthood, a holy nation, set apart. And even when Israel was entering Canaan, God pretty much reminded them that, yes, you will operate within the same space as people, but you should still be identifiable. You should still be identifiable. Especially from our customs, our beliefs, our way of life. And because our way of life, our customs, and our beliefs are affected or impacted by laws, policies, then people of righteousness must see the value of taking or going into position of power. And we see this coming out in Esther. So the question is, and it's an hypothetical question, what would have been the fate of the Jews had Esther not become queen? What would have happened to the Jews if Esther had not become queen? And that's a question I pondered on, and it's a question that, we should all think about. Because we see what has happened because she was queen. So to think about that question out loud, what would have been the outcome had she not been queen? On face value, or at face value, the entire population of Jews would have been annihilated. Because the decree was sent out, the decree had to be upheld. And so, thinking about it, had not God used Esther to intervene, Israel would have been annihilated. Israel being annihilated then would also have a ripple effect, because it would have changed or affected the outcome of our Messiah coming. Because when you examine the scriptures, when you examine the Bible, in Genesis, God said that the woman shall bear a child, the child shall crush the head of the serpent crush the head of the child shall crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent shall bruise the heel of the child. And since then, everything that happens to Israel follows that trajectory of God prophesying about the coming of Jesus. And had Israel been annihilated at this point in time, it would have affected how, or the outcome of Jesus coming. And so we see that God intervened, but had he not done that, we don't know what today would be like. Thank God he intervened. How he intervened has allowed us the opportunity to examine and to understand the importance of Christians being in positions of influence in our society. We're of the view, of being humble. We're of the view of being humble, um, and oftentimes keeping to ourselves because we don't want to get entangled with the world. Had Esther not become queen, I believe, and history would support my belief, that God would find another way of redeeming his people. God has done that on many occasions. So God would have done that on many occasions. For example, when we go to Genesis chapter 4, 40, sorry. Let's go to Genesis chapter 40. All right. we see the story of Joseph. We see the story of Joseph where God 40, 46 to 57, 46 to 57. Oh boy, I think I have the wrong thing here. Ooh. Hold on, let me. Right, 41, sorry. So 41. So 41, right. So Genesis 41. Sorry about that. We see God taking Joseph through a journey of rejection, abandonment, and being sold into slavery. And from the shackles of slavery, Joseph became the right hand of Pharaoh. Became the right hand of Pharaoh. Verse 46 says, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph was assigned to manage the food supply of Egypt at a time when there was a great famine and there was need for food. And when we go to verse 55 says, when all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. And then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. So here is a man of God from a humble beginning, from a point of slavery to the place where the people who hold him as slave have to now come to him by order of their king, and he is now instructing them. He is now instructing them. A second example is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we see this in Daniel chapter 3. If we would like, let me see Daniel chapter 3, where three or four righteous men, were subjected to, well, they were in slavery again, but from slavery to a place of power. The three Hebrew boys served Nebuchadnezzar in different provinces. Daniel, became an advisor. These men were brought into position of power, recognized by their human authority. And what is significant about them is that they did not surrender their faith in God. They did not surrender their value system. And it is interesting to note that it is because of who they were in Christ or in God and their faith and commitment to God, them holding on to their faith and commitment to God, they became examples. In fact, after Nebuchadnezzar saw what God did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he issued a decree that no other gods must be worshipped in the country except the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So as we see with Esther, another example is Sarah, a barren, childless, old woman who is pretty much washed up as it relates to childbearing. God made it clear to her that she will become the mother of nations, the nation through which our Messiah would come. The principle of staying away from offices of influence and power is something that we need to reconsider. Something that we need to reconsider. Because God took Esther, a slave, as Mordecai was a slave. And so Esther would, and God put her in a place of power. So as believers, we should not run or shy away from occupying places of power and influence in our society. How did the Jews benefit from Esther's position of power? How did the Jews benefit from Esther's position of power? Well, keep in mind that the nation and the king and Haman was bringing into being a new form of religion that would become a state religion. And it becoming a state religion, like with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it would directly affect how they live their lives, how they operate, their customs, their faith, as we saw with Daniel. Bow down and worship this golden image, and do not worship any other gods. How did Israel benefit? Or the Jews benefit? Esther, as the queen, represented God in the kingdom and arena of power. Represented God in the kingdom and the arena of power within that empire. She was the presence, voice, and will of God in the palace of the king, among the provinces, in the bed of the king, the heart of the king, and the mind of the king. Single-handedly, Esther represented God throughout the entire kingdom just by being in that position of power. She was the voice of her people, not because they elected her to, but because God placed her there. And that is why Mordecai went out in the city square in his mourning and his sackcloth and his ash, so he could have gotten the attention of the only person of righteousness that was in the king's palace. Well, that is known to Mordecai. Esther was the living example of what Paul states in 1 Corinthians 9:23 and 24. To the weak, I became weak. To win the weak, I became all things to all people so that all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. That I may share in its blessings. What's the correlation here? Well, when we go back to the passage, we see Mordecai saying to Esther, listen, not because you are queen means that you will escape the wrath or the edict of the king. You're a Jew. Once they find out that you are a Jew, whether you're queen or not, they're going to take you. They are going to kill you. And so what Esther had to do then, she now had to put her life literally on the line. She had to put her life on the line. How did Israel benefit? Well, Queen Esther was everything the king needed. And we want to see how God is working in this whole scheme of things. Esther came into the picture, and without question, the king fell in love with her, favored her. And this, when we go into the following chapters, into chapter 5, we will see how this played a role in the outcome. So in her position of king, as queen, Esther was able to combat laws designed to target his people, her people. So in her position of queen, she was able to combat laws that were designed to target Israel. What was the edict? That all Israel should die. That was a law passed. How did they benefit from her position of power? She was able to influence the king to act in God's favor and to carry out God's will. By protecting or preserving the life of God's people. And B, by showing favor to God's servant in Esther. Had she not been in that position of power, she would not have had access to the king to be able to bring about this issue. The third way we see is that in her position of power, she directly intercepted and stopped evil policies that targets righteousness. Evil policies that targets righteousness. It is unrighteous to worship idols. And the policy established by Haman would end the worship of a righteous God by a righteous people and replace it with idolatry, unrighteousness. So not only did it end policies targeting righteousness, it also stopped in the tracks the enemies of God. As when we go into chapter 6, we will see that coming out, where her intervention brought about the demise of the aggressor. What else do we see happening with her being in that position of power? She was able to encourage the promoting of a righteous man over an evil man. We see where Esther reminded the king that Mordecai was the man who brought to their attention the plot. And the king, while sleeping, remembered this, and he decided to honor Mordecai. Had Esther not been in that position of power, she would not have been able to bring to the king's attention the presence of a righteous man. And with that knowledge, God used that knowledge in the king to promote Mordecai and to end Haman. We see by being in that position of power, she was able to use the resources of the king. When we look at verses 4, when we look at verse 4 and we go to verse 9, we see that Esther used the officials. When we go to chapter 5, we see Esther using the resources to organize a banquet. And the purpose of that banquet was to bring an end, to intervene, to lure the king into acting out God's will and bringing an end to the tyranny. And so, as believers, we see Esther being in a position of power, having great influence, and her presence there provided the people with a voice in the bed of the king, in the heart of the king, in the ears of the king. And what is also interesting about it is that she did not have any opposition because of who she was, because of who she was. So it's important for us as believers to not shy away from taking positions of power in our society, finding ourselves or working towards reaching certain offices. What we need to understand, however, having reached those offices, we have to remember our beginning. We have to remember our faith. And we have to remember that us being in those positions has a purpose in God's plan. So that's how we see Esther operating from her position of power. The second thing we want to look at is Esther, the living sacrifice. Esther, the living sacrifice. When we look at the last set of verses, verse 15, 16, 17, We hear Esther coming from, we can take it from, we hear Esther, and this is probably the most famous or notable verse from the book of Esther, and that is verse 16. That's verse 16. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And here is the big statement that we all remember from the book of Esther. If we don't remember anything from the book of Esther, remember this statement. And if I perish, I perish. My friends, that is the mantra of a living sacrifice. If I perish, I perish. But I'm going to see the king not out of my own desire for approval, not out of my desire for acknowledgement and elevation, not out of my desire of our personal agenda, but I have to represent God. And I have to use my position of power to advocate for God's people. This concept of living sacrifice can be linked to Matthew chapter 16. Let's turn our Bibles to Matthew chapter 16. From verse 24, it reads, Then Jesus said to his disciples, Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whosoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone gain? What can anyone give in exchange for their souls? Here is Jesus saying, sacrificial living is the only standard of acceptance. Is the only standard of acceptance. And here we have Esther, thousands of years earlier, saying, I am willing to give my life for God's people. Sacrificial living includes a number of things. One, the surrendering of the physical body to secure our spiritual existence. The surrendering of our physical body to secure our spiritual existence. Second thing this sacrificial life entails is the elevating of God's customs, laws, and teaching over the decree and laws that go contrary to the will of God. Any law, any policy, whether private or government, that is put into place that will prevent us or hinder our worshiping of God, then our commitment to God, even unto death, will come to the fore. Maybe it's a good or a bad thing in the Western Hemisphere. To be Christians and to survive as Christians, it doesn't require us making a decision to lose our physical life for our spiritual one. So we're not faced with that challenge. And that has some negative impacts in that most, especially in the Western society, the value of our Christian faith is undermined by individual self-indulgence. What do I mean by that? People are of the notion that sacrificing our life for the things of God is not required. Rather, we have to sacrifice the things of God to satisfy our own desires. If living for God in this hemisphere meant losing our lives, a lot of us as Christians would think and live differently. And our commitment to God would either increase or we would walk away because we prefer our life, our physical life, for our spiritual life. Another element of sacrificial living is consistency in fasting and praying. Consistency in fasting and praying. We see Esther saying to Mordecai, go, spend time in submitting our bodies. Spend time denying our bodies of physical pleasure, physical satisfaction, so that we can, from a spiritual standpoint, become stronger in combating the evil and wickedness that is at play against us. She says, don't drink for 3 days. The question was asked last week, why 3 days? I am still looking into that, but based on what I am getting is that at the time of this decision, they were in a religious festival, and so they didn't want to go too deep into it. As I said, I'm still trying to ascertain a broader scope and understanding of why 3 days. But the fact of the matter is that they had to deny themselves of earthly satisfaction so as to become spiritually stronger. Why was that important? Because what was at risk, what was at risk was greater than food. What was endangered was their spiritual commitment and relationship with God, which is far more important than physical life. A part of the sacrificial living is the need for Christian unity. If we are going to be living sacrifices, then we have to be united as God's people. And so we see unity taking place here. Esther made it clear that you and the people in Susa need to come together and fast for who? For her, because she was going into the lion's den. She was the sacrifice. And so she needed to be strong spiritually. And she not only required of them to go into fasting for her sake, and by extension, their sake, she said she would do the same. So Esther, being the living sacrifice, highlights the fact that our ability to overcome the world as believers will require us coming together spiritually. Because the truth of the matter is, if Esther fails, then all the Jews will perish. And if all the Jews perish, Esther will perish. And if Esther and the Jews perish, then the people of God will not have that relationship with God anymore. And the voice of God and righteousness would have been removed from the kingdom. And so, my friends, as I close, let us not shy away from positions of power. And remember that we are living sacrifices in this world. Once God's kingdom is under threat, it means that our lives need to be placed on the line to preserve it. May God bless you